Welcome to Digital Garden State, a podcast by the New Jersey Health Information Management Systems Society.
The New Jersey chapter of HIMSS would like to thank their current 2022 corporate sponsors, Business Automation Experts, PKA Technologies, Renner Brown, and ServiceNow.
Welcome to the New Jersey Health Information Management Systems Society podcast series, where we discuss emerging trends in healthcare technology and their impact on our industry. New Jersey HIMSS is a consortium of healthcare professionals, providers, and vendors who are committed to promoting constant improvement in the use of information technology within the healthcare industry. I'm your host, Bryan Welsh, and I'm a board member and president-elect of the New Jersey HIMSS chapter, as well as the manager of clinical information systems at Hunterdon Healthcare. And today I'm joined by Pam Kleshick, IT professional and HIMSS member, and we're going to explore the topic of change management, specifically how it relates to governance. Welcome, Pam.
Hi, Bryan, and thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to share my knowledge and experience around the governance piece of change management. I've been in healthcare for, dare I say, 30 plus years, and really feel that, given the vast experience I've had both in IT and quality management, I really have a good understanding of the importance of change and how it really makes a difference in the healthcare realm.
Wonderful. So, like I said, today's topic is change management, governance. So let's dive right in. So the first thing I'd love to get your perspective on is I think there's a lot of different definitions of change management and what it means to different organizations and different individuals. So if you could just elaborate on what you think change management means and how it impacts an organization overall.
Sure, absolutely. So, I think each person's perception is different when it comes to change. My personal thought is really around the full life cycle of issues that come up and items that come up that impact IT within a healthcare organization. And when you look at change, it is whether, you're implementing something new, you're enhancing something, you have an issue that comes up that's break fix and you need to, implement a change to correct whatever has occurred. I think, it's really about understanding what you're doing and the impact it's going to have, not just in that specific moment, but overall throughout the organization.
Great. Yeah, I think that's important that there's a number of different elements there, and it does impact the whole organization, not just a component. That being said, so I know change is scary for a lot of people. It's difficult for some individuals as well. So I want to focus just on the IT department first before we get into overall organization. So with that, when you're looking at implementing a change management process, how do you go about getting that departmental buy-in, and who are the key players in the department that need to be involved? And if you could just speak to maybe your experience in that realm.
Absolutely. So it's all about inclusion, right? Any process that's implemented can't be done in a silo. It needs to have the right stakeholders in place. When you're talking about IT, and especially IT in healthcare, you have to take into account the application aspect. You have to take into account the infrastructure piece, IT security, all of these factors that come into making sure that whatever change is being implemented has the right representation to make sure the change is going to be effective, right? So when you look to implement, it really comes down to the composite of the governance and who is providing input. It has representation from, your help desk, right? Most changes that occur part of the downfall that a lot of organizations run into is that there's no notification or information about it. And as time has evolved and as change management's become such a big component of service management and the way that organizations are doing things, communicating out what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how you're doing it really has to come to the forefront. So when you look at that, it's about building the right players who are knowledgeable in those areas that can provide the oversight to the changes that you're going to be proposing and putting in place.
Great. So you mentioned two things. One was, having the right stakeholders, and you mentioned a few key players. But could you maybe dive a little bit deeper in what's the best way to go about identifying those stakeholders? Do you need individuals? I know you mentioned the help desk, and some other players, but there's a lot of other areas in IT, application analysts, your CIO, your directors and managers. Do you think it's important that all of those players are involved, or is it just representation maybe from leadership and representation from the analysts? And at what point are there too many stakeholders involved, if that's even, possible?
It's a great question. And there's so many different ways to answer it, because you can come from, if you're an analyst, you want your feedback heard, right? Like you're the one that's going to implement that change. So you feel as though you really need to be able to express why you think that's going to happen. However, there's an importance of structure in how a change management oversight and governance is built, right? So it starts off with the buy-in at the CIO level, right? Your chief information officer is really the one that says, you know what, this is a good approach. Put a change advisory board together and make sure that the processes are followed, right? It doesn't need to necessarily, be involved in the nooks and crannies, but he needs to always be aware of what's going on. And then it becomes a top down, right? So then you get the buy-in from the department directors. But at the department director level, they're not going to be able to sit in on a meeting every week to review changes, right? They're going to kind of be there that if a change doesn't go successfully, then they need to know about it. Again, full circle communication. Then comes the true composite of the change management board. And that's where the governance really comes from. And it's really up to the department directors and managers to assign who they feel will be the best representative from their area to be able to review changes that come in, understand the complexity, and understand how is that change going to impact my area, right? And depending on your process, there's a lot of automation going on around behind the scenes, tools that are used so that changes are known, change requests are known before they occur. So the thinking is that the representative who was, selected by the management team brings that back to their individual areas, shares that with them, and then really becomes the voice of that group. So if you kind of look at it as like, we know this change is coming. I'm going to take it back to my application team. I'm going to share with them, this is the change they want to do. This is how they want to do it. Do you have questions or concerns? And then that person becomes the liaison, brings it to the board, and it gets discussed there. Because you never want to have anybody say, well, my feedback wasn't important, or I wasn't asked, but when the change actually gets approved and truly gets reviewed at that board meeting, that board level, it's got to be a smaller group, because otherwise you won't be able to make progress, right? You get stuck in the weeds with everybody having an opinion. So you do need to minimize the actual governance group, but that shouldn't minimize the information that's coming in from your respective areas. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think that's an important element is, I think for any committee or any board, you want to have that right balance of the right representatives there, but you also don't want it to be, a meeting of 50 people that you just can't get your agenda completed. So I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think it's very great information. So with the Change Advisory Board and looking at membership, is it important to have representation outside of the IT realm? Or is it more so that Change Board is, like you said, the liaisons between IT internally and externally, or should we have that representation across the board?
So again, this is kind of an area where you really have to look at the composite of your application portfolio, right? As IT and technology becomes more ingrained in the delivery of services throughout healthcare organizations, the representation from non-IT departments, such as your lab, such as radiology, their feedback and input and participation on the change board really becomes important. When you think of a change and what that means, right? It's you've got something that needs to be modified within your environment. It's almost like an octopus, right? There's outreaching tentacles that occur from what one individual may think, oh, it's only affecting my area. And we have found historically over time that if you don't broaden the representation at a change management board, then you're really losing sight of the changes going on within the organization, inside of your infrastructure. So there is absolutely a value and a need to have your strongest driven IT associated departments. And what I mean by that is, I'm going to use the laboratory as a perfect example. There are softwares that are used within a lab that are very specific to their department, but reaches out to all areas of a hospital, right? Your nursing floors, your outpatient labs. When the change gets made in that realm, it crosses over and affects other areas. It affects servers. It affects wireless. It affects things. So that person who is educated and knowledgeable in that specific application can't really share that information with somebody at an IT level to have it fully represented. So in those areas, having that person have an actual seat at the table is really important. You'll also see in other cases where representatives will come in as a guest, so to speak, when changes are coming up in their area. They'll come, they may present it. Change management in IT and IT healthcare is expanded so much over the past 5 to 10 years because of the way that technology has grown. And it's not necessarily that everyone needs to have that seat or representation, but the communication and knowledge and understanding needs to be there from the CEO down, right? That's why a lot of organizations have change management policies that are implemented. And those change management policies are at the organizational level. And that's really to help control changes that are going to occur in your environment, making sure that the structure's there, the governance oversight is there, and the understanding and communication piece. I know that was a lot of information all at once. I'm very passionate about change management. When you've been in it as long as I have, you've seen it grow and you've seen the importance. And I'm a firm believer that any process that you're going to have in place really comes back to the communication and the support and buy-in from the leadership at every level.
That's wonderful. And you mentioned 3 great topics. One is how a change has so many different tentacles, and applications affect infrastructure affects applications, which affects clinical. And we actually are going to spend on another podcast in this series, the whole time talking about how infrastructure and applications play a role and how they interact with one another. So Excellent. It's a great segue to that. The other thing you mentioned is bringing in the clinical staff. and then communication and compliance. So I'm going to take each of those areas and then we'll just dive in a little bit more. So the first one is, as you're bringing in clinical staff or other areas into the change management process, how do you go about convincing, and I don't know if that's the right word, but helping the clinical areas understand the importance of the process? Because I think what is sometimes seen is, a change management process is just more paperwork that needs to be done, and it actually slows down or could even hinder a quick turnaround for workflow improvement or process improvements, or even just new application software. So how do you go about ensuring that to the clinical staff that this is actually helping, and it's not a hindrance?
So I think there's a couple of pieces to it. You mentioned earlier about change being scary, and when you look at cultural environments where they do have that perception of IT being a barrier or trying to slow things down, really comes all about communication once again. And I know it seems like it's something that is minor, but being fully transparent with those clinical areas, explaining to them, we're looking to give you the opportunity of proper testing, right? Nobody wants to put a change in that hasn't been properly tested to then have a system go down and you got to roll back, all because the change management methodology wasn't followed, right? And so I think that really having that solid relationship with your department liaisons and explaining the process to them and why we're doing it, having them understand that the sooner that we know that a change needs to take place, the sooner it's able to go through the review process and be implemented. It comes back to communication. And I think after they see the process actually work and understand how it goes, they're more receptive. And look, things happen, right? Emergencies come up. Changes need to be done on the drop of a dime. And so if your process is solid enough, you're going to have a policy that's built around that. There are emergency changes, and those emergency changes have a different approval process. Doesn't mean that you can't do the change. It means that you do what is ever in the best interest of the department in order to continue to provide the patient care and the level of care that your organization's used to, but by following the process of documenting and capturing it, and then going back and looking at those emergency changes and saying, what can we have done differently? Could we have looked at the timing differently? So again, I think it's really working with those clinical areas, those non-IT areas of really bringing them into the fold and being part of the process, part of the solution, and helping to drive change in a positive manner.
Perfect. And I think everything you said is important. And, no one likes a system downtime. So if this can prevent that, I think, it's a win-win across the board, like you said. You talk about communication, and I'm just wondering, when we're going about implementing a change management process and then these liaisons, who really is responsible for that communication? Is that the CIO? Is that the director? Is it, like you mentioned, the CEO? Who should be the one communicating out to the organization that we're going to be implementing this and that it is something that we need to follow?
When you're talking about implementing change management initially, it really needs to come from that CEO, senior leadership level. It could be your CIO as long as it's fully supported by the CEO. But what everyone in the organization needs to know is that this isn't an IT-driven initiative. It really is an over-encompassing organizational initiative, and making sure that everyone understands the importance, everyone understands why we're doing it, and getting that support is part of what makes it successful. And then when you get to the change notification, you really want to look at your customer care centers or your help desk or your whoever provides the majority of communication. You want to streamline that so that your end users don't get confused with unnecessary information and what truly needs to be out there and communicated when you're doing changes. Having a process in place so that people know, oh, this is coming from this area. I want to make sure I read it. I know now that it's going to affect this. A network downtime's occurring. This is when and why. So it's all about streamlining processes, making sure that everyone's aware and everyone's on board.
100%. Couldn't agree more. So the last thing I just want to bring up, and I think this is an important part, is compliance. So when implementing a change management process, in the beginning and even throughout, what's the best way to track compliance? How do we ensure that the IT department, but also the clinical departments, are following a change management process, and you don't have someone going rogue and implementing outside of that process? Are there any analytics or data points that you can capture, or is it really just each IT liaison being responsible for tracking that compliance?
It really gets down to your ability of monitoring. When you talk about how do you know changes are occurring, right? And the compliance piece. So there's many ways to be able to do it. A lot of it is heavily on the relationships that are built between those departmental liaisons, having the open lines of communication that change is occurring. The other is knowing and being able to monitor your infrastructure and your environment and have the tools in place to be able to identify if a change has occurred, that you can then look back at your change management calendar and say, something occurred, but we didn't know about it, right? So it becomes a full process of, knowing the changes that are coming through, getting them approved, having a calendar you can refer to, capturing the information in a service management tool, whether it be ServiceNow, Fresh Service. There's a lot of tools out there that allow you to capture change management information and data, but it then goes beyond that to your environment and knowing when changes are happening, and if they do happen and we're not aware, not to take the, slap on the wrist, you did something wrong, how dare you, but to use it as a teaching moment to be able to meet with the departments and be able to say, look, we have this great process in place for change management. Let me introduce you to it and explain why it's important. And you'll find when you do that the compliance piece becomes easy because then they're vested in it and they understand the importance. And then, it starts to become second nature and people don't fear change. They then begin to welcome it.
Wonderful. And I think that's when you come into a great cohesive environment, is when that shift from fear to welcoming change occurs. I think is when you really start to see some great things.
Yeah, I agree.
So we're coming up on the end of our time with one another, but is there any, final thoughts that you'd like to add related to change management in general, governance in general, or really just anything in health IT?
No, I think I would just like to add, this is such an important topic when, change is all around us and it affects so many different things. And when you have an opportunity to put a good process in place and understand the importance of especially in healthcare, how everything that we do at the end of the day affects that patient. And that's why we're here. It's why we're doing what we do, and being able to ensure that the process for around change management and implementing those changes throughout the healthcare organization are so important. So, I really appreciate you giving me the time to share my experience and my knowledge in this area. And, if you have any additional questions, you know how to reach out to me.
Yes. And I want to thank you, Pam, for taking the time to meet with me and, be a part of this podcast and, offer your insights to our community. And I think there were a lot of great points here. And, I think the individuals who are looking at implementing a change management process, if they don't have one already, have a lot of good takeaways here. And even those individuals who may have a change management process but are looking to just, make it a little bit more effective or efficient, I think there are some great takeaways here too. So I really appreciate you joining, and I thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right, well, that wraps up our discussion on change management governance. We hope that you enjoyed it as much as we did. We look forward to our next podcast in this series on change management. In the meantime, please check out all of our other podcasts for interesting information technology topics on your favorite podcast platforms. On behalf of our guests and the New Jersey HIMSS chapter, we thank you for listening and have a great day.